Now that you've read and discussed this text and gotten a little bit more familiarity with the details presented in it, I'd like to first provide a little background about Jewish expectations around eating. We're doing this first because I'm going to expect some of you know this relatively well because it so frequently comes up in the Gospels, but it's here as well. See, in Second Temple Judaism at this time, there is, of course, restrictions for what Jewish people could eat. That is from the Old Testament. We're all very familiar with it. Some foods are forbidden to eat. Some foods can be eaten in certain cases or if it's prepared in certain ways. Some foods are not only encouraged to eat, but practically they ate a lot just because it's what they happen to have. But the piece that is also present is with whom you can eat. It wasn't just what the food was, but what the company was and how you would eat. That's not as clear from the Old Testament, but was very frequently practiced in the first century. It's one of the reasons Jesus' message about commensality is so radical. But I want to frame it a little bit, because when you're reading this text about the conflict of Antioch, what is it that is the problem of eating together? And why does it matter? It just feels exclusionary to a lot of us now that you'd have to not eat with these other people. Well, scholars in fact disagree as to what the problem was. Was it the food that was presented? Meaning, if Gentiles are providing food, would it not be kosher? Or was it just a more general, we can't eat at the same place? And there might be a reason for this. That is, if you look at the Old Testament, there's not rules for restricting just Jewish people from eating with Gentiles. But there are restrictions for the priests. The priests could only eat with priests. They had an even more strict purity code. Well, what we can reconstruct about the Pharisees, and some people will disagree with this because we are reconstructing, but what we seem to reconstruct is that they didn't like that there was one group who had further purity restrictions than others, and they said, we think everybody should live and work like a priest. And so that's what they encouraged. And then, therefore, now everybody cannot eat just with anybody. You can only eat with those who are also ritually pure. But it's important to understand why. It's not just because they wanted to be inhospitable, but because where we worshipped changed in Second Temple Judaism. Most people could not go to the temple to worship, at least not very often. They didn't live nearby. Paul's writing this letter or talking about people who lived in Antioch. Would have been a terribly far distance in the ancient world to get there, to Jerusalem. And so instead, the place they worshipped was either at the synagogue, just means gathering place, or at the dinner table. The dinner table was a place people worshipped. That's why all the hand washing before they would go eat, it was not about germs, they didn't understand that. It was about before we worship, we ritually are purified so that we're preparing our hearts and minds for worship. We do that in our worship service, prepare our hearts and minds for worship. But now, we're doing this when we're eating at the dinner table because that's a worship space. So this idea of who do we worship with? And what does that mean? How do we worship? Does it work in mixed community or not? That's the issue at hand. And so when we see this, it's not just about them only wanting to be with people like them. It was, how do we worship before God? And maybe they weren't so convinced that these Gentiles were preparing themselves to worship in the same way. And frankly, maybe it was, if the priests have to be separate in order to worship rightly, then shouldn't everybody? We don't want the priests to be different from everyone else. We're egalitarian. So now thinking about that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what would it mean for you to be eating together if it was a worship space? How would that change the dynamic? And maybe we'll get a little bit of the gravity of the situation.